I've been asked to speak about Israel and the end times, and we have done a comprehensive briefing that profiles the Middle East called The Roots of War, and I'm going to excerpt relevant portions of that to try to respond to the anxiety that all of us have as we appear to be moving on the threshold of a major engagement. An engagement that is not going to be another Afghanistan. It could be much more serious. Now, we're dealing with players that have nuclear weapons. Now, the whole Middle East is, of course, a cauldron. And I'm always reminded of Macbeth. Double, double, toil and trouble, fire, burn, and cauldron bubble. And in this cauldron, we have about 10 players. The major players in the Middle East. Many of which have nuclear weapons, almost all of which have biological weapons, and all of them have missiles of substantial ranges. So we're going to talk a little bit, to put this in background, we're going to talk about the ancient empires, because you need to understand these to really understand what's going to be happening over the next few months, few years, what have you. We'll talk about the ancient empires that most of you that are biblically sensitive are familiar with, but we're going to try to put them in perspective. Then we'll talk about the current contestants. Iraq, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Syria, Jordan, Turkey. We usually include Pakistan and India, not because they're in the Middle East, but they're both nuclear combatants that are also almost on a daily basis threatening each other. And then we'll try to talk about the possibilities that this might be on the threshold of the coming climax. We'll talk about a little bit briefly the Magog invasion and the Battle of Armageddon. And I'm going to presume that many of you, most of you probably, are regulars and have done some homework, so I will be going rather quickly. The ancient empires might be called the tides of history. Most of us recognize that civilization had its origins in what's often called the Fertile Crescent, with Egypt, Assyria, and Babylonia in this region that is the cradle of civilization. And we know that from in Genesis 11, at one time there was one language on the planet Earth, probably Hebrew. And we know that there was a world dictator by the name of Nimrod, which means we will rebel. And this all started at the plain of Shinar, at Babel, the tower to heaven. An astrological temple. The zodiac was corrupted after that. And I won't start on that here, but we don't have time. But we can look at the Bible as a tale of two cities. The city of Babylon is the city of man, and the city of Jerusalem is the city of God. And we're all familiar, I think, with the fall of all of that. The earliest civilization being the Assyrian, then following Egypt, then Assyria, and then the Babylonian Empire. A city called Babylon rose to power, took over the whole thing, and became the Babylonian Empire. Most of us are familiar with Daniel chapter 2, as also amplified by Daniel chapter 7, where Nebuchadnezzar's dream is interpreted by Daniel, and of course lays out the empires, 4 of them, the last one being in 2 phases. And that is clearly laid out in the Daniel 2 and Daniel 7. Most of you are familiar with it. And most scholars recognize the last 2 phases being the same empire in 2 phases, Daniel 7 amplifying that with some clarity. Babylon did indeed endure till about 539, was succeeded by the Persians, which of course were succeeded by Alexander the Great and the Greek Empire. And it broke up in a way that we need to understand, because there's some profound insights in the scripture that many of us miss. And I want to touch on that before we're through. And then of course that was succeeded by Rome. We'll call it Rome Phase 1. Each of these empires was successfully conquered by the previous one, the successor one, until Rome. Who conquered Rome? The answer, nobody. It broke into pieces, and according to Daniel 7 and 2, that those pieces will reassemble into a final form about which the scripture says a great deal. Well, the Babylonian Empire, of course, was succeeded by the Persian Empire, and which was succeeded by the Greek Empire. Now, when the Greek Empire breaks up, Daniel chapter 11 details some surprising aspects of that. The first few verses are simply the conquest by Cyrus, the Persians, and so forth. But by the time you get to verse 3, you're talking about Alexander the Great, the Greek Empire being set up. So the first 2 verses are the Persian Empire. The rest of the chapter talks about the Greek Empire and what follows. When Alexander the Great dies, and incidentally Babylon was his capital, his 4 generals divide up the empire. Cassandra and Lysimachus took their portions, and it's the last two, Seleucus and Ptolemy, we want to pay special attention to, because in that detail, God gives us a glimpse of what's coming ahead of us. And Cassandra and Lysimachus took those portions that are really Turkey. Seleucus took the east, Ptolemy took the south, and there are so-called 400 silent years between the close of the Old Testament and the beginning of the New. They're often called that by scholars, the silent years, but they're not silent. God laid out the details of those 400 years in advance in Daniel chapter 11. And Ptolemy and Seleucus have wars between the two, the successive dynasties, and they are detailed in Daniel 11, and that occasions a glimpse of what's coming at the end times that many of us, even very diligent students of prophecy, have overlooked some aspects of. And we're going to touch on that before we're finished. Obviously, the Greek Empire was succeeded by the Roman Empire. And let me tell you right up front, all of us, I should say many of us on the platform, biblical platforms, have fallen into the trap of assuming that when you speak of the Roman Empire, you're talking about Western Europe. We forget that the Roman Empire had two legs, and the eastern leg survived the western leg by over 1,000 years. And we'll talk about that. Rome, of course, as it rose, absorbed Greece in 146, then Lysimachus' kingdom 133, Seleucus' kingdom in 64, then Egypt, Ptolemy's kingdom in 31. And all of these elements disappear from history before the birth of Christ. We had the Roman Empire in place, providing the roads and the communications to make the spread of the gospel possible subsequently. The eastern leg of this empire endures 1,000 years longer than the western leg. We tend to call it the Byzantine Empire, but it's really the Roman Empire in its final 1,000 years. And it's Seleucus' kingdom that many of us as scholars have overlooked some of the things that God has revealed in his prophecies in Daniel 11, 7 and 8, and also 11. And what's also going on then subsequent to all this is the rise of Islam. Muhammad is born in Mecca, as you all know, and of course that becomes ultimately a widespread movement. In fact, Charles Martel at Tours, France, that it arrests its development and prevents it spreading into Europe. And now the Crusades also occur, and they weaken this the eastern leg of the empire, so it finally falls to the Muslims. I won't go through the details here; they're well documented for those of you who are going to study. And from about the 16th century on to the First World War, this region is dominated by the Ottoman Empire. And we'll talk briefly about that as we go. But subsequently, in more recent years, each one of these elements that were previously subsumed by these empires starts to emerge as independence in history. 1906, Iran; 1921, Afghanistan; 1922, Egypt; also Iraq, both emerged in that year; Turkey, Lebanon, Syria in 1938, 1946, Jordan, 47, Pakistan is created in effect as a Muslim concession to create the next day they freed India. And then, of course, Israel in 1948. It's interesting that each of these elements that were subsumed by this stream of empires is now emerging as independent fragments in our present scene. Egypt, of course, being formerly part of the Ptolemaic region, and the rest of these part of Seleucus, if you will. So now we have in the Middle East today then these players, of course. We've got Israel, Syria, Iraq, Jordan, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and Iran. We're going to focus on those and get those a little bit in the context in terms of their history, but also where they stand today. And of course Turkey, which is unique in that it's a NATO member, and that carries some interesting implications.